Okay, so let's get started. Let me introduce myself. My name is Steve Aronsoff. I'm a SVP of marketing at FlexPay. We are a fintech company in the payment space, helping to recover failed payments. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I think is quite interesting. And really, we're going to focus around what scope of responsibility should fraud teams within merchants have, and is there an opportunity to think differently about this role when there's a more direct understanding of the total cost of that fraud causes on your business. So what's interesting about fraud teams is that, and what I really like about how fraud teams look at their role is that they take an approach typically to try to eliminate about 100% of fraud in your business, because fraud obviously has very high costs. They cause cost directly in terms of lost sales, but there's also additional costs and fees and penalties and mitigation costs that are imparted by managing fraudulent transactions when they're charged back to the payment system. So it's a lot of cost and effort and time that goes into dealing with this problem. But the reality is those costs are harmful and they're direct, and we completely recognize them. But there's another form of harm that fraud causes to your business that we want to introduce and actually build a case that the fraud scope of responsibility, the mission that fraud teams have, should be expanded to include this type of fraud as well. And one of the reasons that we're going to make this argument is that too often we see that companies that do recognize this other type of fraud and the harm it causes takes a more laissez-faire attitude towards solving it, meaning that they'll be satisfied with good results versus the way that fraud teams tend to look at fraud as the mandate to try to eliminate as much of it as possible, and where the costs are minimized to the nth degree. And I recognize completely this is a new way of thinking. So as we go through today's presentation, periodically I'm going to ask for feedback from everybody attending to see if you have any thoughts about the way that you view this and about the way that your teams are structured in your areas of responsibility. So look forward to that. Let's start our conversation talking about what are the responsibilities typically that we see within the fraud teams in merchants. So first of all, typically what we find is that fraud teams are focused mostly on risk mitigation and cost reduction, reducing the cost of fraud by eliminating it from happening. And so the two core areas that are focused on around fraud management, developing strategies and working on systems and processes that act to identify and prevent fraudulent transactions from passing through the business. And then also working with internal partners and compliance processes to ensure that the transaction processing through the business is secure, so that bad actors cannot get access to your data and not cause additional harm and mayhem within your business. In addition to the active efforts, there's a lot of prevention processes and support for prevention that go into the business. So that involves all the reporting and analysis of looking at your fraud patterns and fraud rates, finding the factors that correlate with fraud so that those areas could be reinforced in the business. Of course, working with companies like Count and Signify that provide solutions that can be configured to optimize for your business. And then all the policies and procedures and guidance with working with your customer service team and legal and compliance to find the right balances between minimizing the impact of fraud and still creating as much efficiency for the business. And lastly, of course, that also involves dealing with all the fraud that actually occurs, the chargeback management, and dealing with disputes that have to be focused on that are just a cost of doing business, unfortunately. So this is going to be one of the interactive portions of today's presentation. I'd like to ask everybody attending, does this scope feel like the way that your business operates? Do you have any feedback on your area of responsibility? Are there other areas that you do focus on in addition to these? And please feel free to use the Q&A box if you have any thoughts. I'd love to get any feedback as we go through this so that we can share best practices and learnings, because I don't think any companies have really taken an exact same approach to fraud and how they deal with it within their businesses. Okay, I don't see any feedback, so let's assume that this is largely right. If you want to comment as we go through this and think about the question about the way that your teams are structured and what your fraud teams are responsibility, please feel free to use the chat box, and we'll get through the questions and the feedback later in the session. Okay, so one of the, I think, the insights that we can look at when we look at the scope is that the area of focus is around managing the direct cost of fraud, preventing it from occurring, and doing whatever is within your control to avoid submitting the fraudulent transactions to the payment system. But the reality is that there are other types of losses and harm and damage to your business that fraud in the payment system imparts on you, that causes you harm to your business. And we're going to talk about that with some depth today. And so when we talk about the role of fraud teams and their scope of responsibility, we're going to make the argument that the scope should be expanded to be not just inwardly focused on what happens within business, the processes and procedures and policies to limit transactions flowing through the business that turn out to be fraudulent, but also to focus on the larger issue of fraud in the payment system and have to deal and have the active management of what happens, particularly within the banking system, that causes harm to your business. And so that's what we're going to talk a lot about today in order to be able to expand your understanding of what this means. So let's talk about the banking system and fraud. Clearly, fraud is a growing problem. It gets worse every year. There are enormous numbers of bad actors out there using sophisticated technology and AI. We hear all the time about hacks on systems and stealing of customer data. And the reality is that banks are facing increasing losses on the transactions that turned out to be fraudulent that they have underwritten and committed to paying. So globally, the banking system will lose about $30 billion plus in fraud losses every year. And the response to that has been to become increasingly conservative in the way that they evaluate transaction authorization requests. Of course, banks, every time they're presented with an opportunity for a transaction to approve, it's essentially making an underwriting decision. Do they want to approve the transaction and underwrite the risk on it, or let it, or prevent it? And they've made the decision consciously that they would rather take the hit on declining a legitimate transaction because the pain is a couple of pennies on the transaction cost, versus in many cases take on the risk of a large purchase or a recurring purchase where the losses may be hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars even. So the $30 billion in fraud losses that banks absorb have translated in their direct actions to overly aggressive efforts to decline transactions. In fact, over $400 billion of legitimate transactions are actually declined every year because of the way that banks view their risk and their efforts to reduce their fraud losses. So we talk about the issue of fraud in the payment system. This is really what we mean, that banks are making decisions that are really taking their business to heart. It's very logical to be able to see why they're taking these steps and making these decisions, but the harm that it poses on merchants in terms of lost revenue is very, very dramatic. In fact, typically the indirect costs on businesses, whether e-commerce or subscription-based, are often orders of magnitude larger than the direct fraud costs that companies are more easily able to see. Now, we know that we talk about bad actors. All fraud is essentially gone online. It's much easier for fraudsters to work in that environment and do harm. So it's really instructive to look at how banks react to the transactions that are being presented through different mediums. So this chart shows the results of a survey or a study that Visa and Walmart partnered on. And what they did was they tracked the same cohort of customers, the exact same cards being used in in-person, in-store transactions, when those same people, the same card went online to purchase through e-commerce, and then when those cards are being used on recurring billing authorization requests for subscriptions. And what we see is a very different decline rate based on how the issuing bank perceived the risk of the transaction. Again, it's really instructive to look at this and say, remember that these are the same people, the same cards. So theoretically, the risk profile for the bank should be identical, but because they are able to see the transaction type and where it's being presented through, they do view the risk vector very differently. And so the banks will decline on the face of where the transaction is being submitted in very different ways. So the outcome, this translates directly to the prior slide. When we talk about that $450 billion plus of declined transactions, what we see is that, again, the risk is essentially the same for the people based on their risk profile. So 2/3, and this is actually Visa's conclusion, 2/3 of the failed payments, the declines that the banks make, are actually caused by false declines. The banks make an error in their decision where they see signs of risk, often because of where the transaction type is occurring, and make a decision to decline the transaction. And of course, the card not present transactions in e-commerce and recurring are particularly hard hit by this. And that's really the harm. That's what we talk about when we speak to the indirect costs of fraud that harm merchants, really talking about the bank errors that are causing declined payments. So let's stick here for a minute and talk about the idea that we know, of course, in your traditional role of managing fraud, that limiting the passing of fraudulent transactions through your business is absolutely critical. Fraudulent transactions are expensive, they're messy, and they cause headaches and harm. But when we think about an unrecovered failed payment where the bank has made a decision to decline the transaction from a good customer, one of your customers that you spent a lot of effort and dollars to acquire, the harm is actually quite a bit larger than what it seems like on the surface. And what I mean by that is, particularly for subscription businesses that have recurring billing models, when a failed payment occurs and it's not recovered, the reality is that there's not just a lost transaction, it's actually a churned customer. We look at the failed payment, the moment when it occurs, as essentially a moment of truth, meaning that when a failed payment occurs as a merchant in a business, either you're able to recover the payment, and that means that that customer continues to bill through their subscription for months after the recovery, and the total value of that customer is still realized, or alternatively, the failed payment is not recovered. And what that means is that all the future payments of that customer that we're going to bill for you are lost because that customer is churned. You're not able to bill them successfully. And so we like the idea of the metaphor of the iceberg as a way to be able to demonstrate this concept that what seems like on the surface is a single transaction at risk for subscription businesses. In fact, there's a much larger economic impact and harm that's caused by failed payments that are not recovered. So our recommendation and our guidance to companies is that it makes logical sense for the payment fraud teams to expand their scope of responsibility to include not just management of the direct fraud costs that harm your business, but to also focus on the additional harm that fraud is inherent in the payment system is causing your business. So the focus means in ways, there's actually other implications here that I think are quite profound, in that also shifts the responsibility and strategic value of fraud teams from cost avoidance and cost mitigation to actually connecting the fraud teams also to revenue and profit growth, meaning that by focusing and expanding the role of responsibility to include failed payment recovery and the systems and processes that optimize the results from the failed payment recovery system, what you're able to do is actually connect the benefits to the core operating KPIs of your business, which are typically revenue, customer retention, and profitability, which are all very, very important factors that every subscription business is trying to maximize, of course. So one of the reasons that we make this case that the fraud team role should be expanded to include the management of failed payments is that, in fact, when you look at the fraud teams and what their scope of responsibilities, the skills that they have within those teams, we actually believe they're uniquely suited to be able to help solve this problem. What I mean by that is when we look at companies that optimize their failed payment recovery and minimize the harm of the churn that's caused by failed payments, we see some common patterns. And these patterns correlate very closely with the skills that are inherently within the fraud teams. Fraud teams, for example, are very skilled at evaluating systems and solutions to help solve problems. For example, in fraud avoidance, the fraud teams will work with solution providers like Count or Signified or Riskified to choose the systems that will identify the fraudulent transactions. Fraud teams, they know that they shouldn't try to build this themselves because they're specialized companies that have solved those problems. They often take a multidisciplinary approach to solving the problem, and they're looking to solve it. Not just optimize and minimize the harm, but actually solve the problem to the nth degree. And they do that through the creation of reporting and the development of new metrics to track what happens in the business and to measure results. And so those ideas of the best practices of companies around choosing third-party solutions that are optimized for the solution versus trying to build a solution internally, which we see a lot of companies start their journey on solving failed payments with a home-built solution, which don't deliver the best results. They often don't, the companies that do best often have specialized reporting and metric tracking that focus just on the failed payment flows through business and the recovery, and a direct connection on the understanding of when customers are recovered, what is the total value of that customer? So they make optimization decisions, and they work with multidisciplinary teams that can optimize the experience through that journey for their customers, that will try to minimize visibility of the problems. The customer's not aware of it. When the customers are involved, to be able to craft experiences that will engage the customers and not harm the customer satisfaction. And again, the focus really should be on not just recovery of the failed payment, but also the retention of those customers, because that's directly tied to your revenue. And again, these are things, the systems, the system design, the system selection, reporting, creating working teams to solve problems across disciplines like customer service and customer support and payments and finance. Those are all skill sets that the fraud teams already have. So it's a really natural fit to include the management of failed payments into the scope of responsibility. So when fraud teams take this step and work to align themselves around failed payments, there's actually some very strong benefits the fraud teams not only can help deliver, but also help unlock within their own teams. So they help solve the single largest subscriber churn, which is involuntary churn. Obviously, there are many reasons why customers choose to end their subscription, but we see within subscription companies that often customer losses from failed payments, there's actually a phrase for it called involuntary churn, is usually the single largest source of churn as a single factor. Is very common, where 40 to 50% of subscriber losses are actually due to involuntary churn. That's a number that probably seems shockingly high, but if you don't track your voluntary churn from your involuntary churn separately, it's really hard to understand the total cost of what harm it's causing your business. Secondly, it can also help you get focused around aligning your delivery of customer retention. Customer retention for subscription businesses is always going to be one of the core objectives and core factors that are looking to be managed because of the direct connection between increased retention, revenue growth, and profitability. And then lastly, the whole idea of trying to maximize the customer value, customer lifetime value. The longer and the more that retention can be increased translates directly into increased customer lifetime value, which directly benefits company profitability and return on investment from acquiring new customers. So this shift of expansion, this expansion of role to include failed payment recovery, allows the fraud teams to start being aligned on the revenue side of the business and the performance side of the business, versus just helping decrease costs, which we think is incredibly valuable for the fraud teams and their role within the business, their level of importance. So I do want to throw out an introduction. If you're not familiar with FlexPay, we have a state-of-the-art failed payment recovery solution. We have two variations that we use. Some failed payments can be solved working directly with the payment system. Our philosophy and our approach is that we always want to eliminate customer visibility to the failed payment. We have research and data that proves to us that when customers are exposed to failed payments, there is immediately a bad brand experience that's created, where the subscriber will blame you, the merchant, for the failed payment, and not the bank that made the authorization decision. And the reason for that is clear. Their bank card will usually work with other merchants, but when it's declined specific with your merchant, for example, because it was a recurring or an e-commerce transaction, that's the association that's made in your customer's minds. So we want to avoid that from occurring. We want the experience to be seamless and invisible to the customer. Our invisible recovery solution is very, very sophisticated. It's powered by AI. We've been at this for a while. We're actually on I believe, our 30th generation of AI model. We have multiple AI models optimized for different decline codes and reason types. And it's incredibly effective at the maximum delivery of recovery when we can actually recover a failed payment directly with the banking system. We also know that some failed payments are caused by cards that are no longer active, where we cannot solve the problem working with the banking system. We actually have to involve your customer. And we've optimized a program that is powered by a branch of science called behavioral science. It really is powered by an understanding of how people make decisions. And what our objective is to create outreach programs that are highly effective, and they're optimized not just for inspiring and spurring your customer to take the action that's desired, which is to help solve the problem with their card, but to do so in a way that maintains a very, very positive customer satisfaction experience and doesn't cause any harm to the retention after they're involved in that process. So we currently use SMS and email for that. There's other channels that are possibly available, but it's an incredibly important adjunct to really delivering the top level of failed payment recovery solution, our delivery of performance, because of the fact that we can combine not just the solution to work with the payment system, but also engage with their customers as needed in a way that's more effective than typical customer service outreach programs. And the goal of the payments experience that we're always trying to support is very much aligned with how you look at your world, which is we want to extend your subscriber relationships. We want to help increase your customer lifetime value, and we want to improve all of your core operating KPIs. And the beauty about solving failed payments is that all these outcomes are created naturally by maximizing the recovery of failed payments. When we can cover failed payments, we reduce customer churn immediately. And this is what's really neat about the top solutions like FlexPay, is that as a comparison to voluntary churn programs that take time to implement and deploy, and often that involves software installations that have to be configured, with failed payment recovery, literally the benefits start the moment that it's turned on. And the expansion, the reduction in churn, the expansion of customer lifetime value occurs immediately. It grows over time, of course, as more and more customers are recovered and they continue to bill. It has a compounded revenue growth effect on your business, but literally the benefit starts on day one. And all these benefits of increased retention, increased revenue, not improve your core business metrics, not just revenue, but because the revenue from recovered customers is incredibly profitable, there's no acquisition costs involved in that revenue. It's actually typically the most highly profitable revenue that your business will see. So let's summarize what we talked about today. When we think about failed payments, our request, our suggestion, our guidance is that approach the same level of rigor and attention and the same mandate to all sources of fraud, all causes of harm that fraud causes, whether it's the mandate to be able to reduce the submission of fraudulent transactions for your business. You work to try to eliminate 100% of those. And in the same manner, take that approach that good enough is never good enough, that you want to be able to have the highest level of performance on your failed payment recovery to minimize the harm that the bank's efforts to reduce fraud on their side are causing on your business. This approach also allows you to expand your remit, your area of responsibility, from risk mitigation and prevention and cost reduction to the actual core KPIs that the company's trying to optimize for: revenue, profitability, customer retention, all the key operating values. So let me stop there and pause. Let's make this also part of the interactive area of today's conversation. I'd love to have feedback from you on your thoughts and reactions to these proposals and these ideas. Does this make sense? And do you have any questions about any of the topics that we talked about? Please use the Q&A box on your desktop. While you're thinking about that, I also want to point out that if you're from the fraud system, the fraud world of your company, you're probably not familiar with failed payment recovery solutions. On the desktop in the presentation, there's actually a document we've placed that's a scorecard that can be used to compare the different options in the marketplace. And what's really valuable about the scorecard is it cues you as to what questions to ask of the different solutions. It can be used if you have already an internal system that your payments team built. It can be used to compare to solutions like FlexPay or other providers in the marketplace. And you can stack order each of those in terms of how well they deliver on the promise of each question. I think that scorecard is also valuable because it does give you an insight into how complex this can be in terms of the nuances. You may think that a simple solution is going to be good enough, but the scorecard will identify areas that you should factor in. And again, if you have any questions about that, we're always here to help you and provide guidance and support for you as you go through your journeys, regardless of whether you work for with FlexPay or not. Okay, I do see the first question coming in. The question is, have we seen any fraud teams that have taken this approach and they've been able to actually move the needle in a more meaningful way? And the answer is yes. We have seen a handful of companies start to take this approach. Remember, I mentioned earlier that we see some commonalities in companies that are delivering the top recovery results from their failed payments. One of the factors we see on the companies that really get this, that are very enlightened, is the creation of a equivalent of a chief subscription officer. I mean, the title doesn't have to exist, but having someone with responsibility to look across processes, to look across teams, and to orchestrate how the processes are managed is incredibly valuable. And we see that the companies that get that are much more likely to be top financial performance. I think that I believe the number is companies that take that approach are 10 times more likely to be top financial performers than the companies that keep all their teams separate and focus on their parts of the process versus the holistic management of the process. In the same way, the fraud teams that are involved can help enable that. And I think that's the connection between the financial performance and the fraud teams that are starting to expand their scope. Is they can orchestrate the efforts, they can orchestrate the selection of the best software solutions and solution providers, and in the tracking and reporting systems to make sure that insights around how the process is working, the results that are being delivered, and the optimization of the process are being shared across the organization between finance, between payments, between customer service and support, and the teams that are responsible for customer retention. Okay, we don't have any more questions yet, but I will stay on the line for a few more minutes. If you want to ask an additional question, I will be online to be able to get back to you with it. First of all, I want to thank you very much for attending. Hopefully the content was interesting. Again, I recognize that these are probably new areas of interest for you, or areas or proposals for how the fraud teams can be configured and managed. But I do think that the concepts are incredibly important, and we're starting to see that companies that take this approach are seeing better results from their financial KPIs. Again, customer retention, revenue, and profitability. So we absolutely recommend this, and we're happy to help you on your journey. If you're looking for guidance or want to talk to us about our failed payment recovery solution and whether it's a good fit for your business in terms of being able to reduce your involuntary churn losses, increase revenue, and solve your problem, we'd love to chat with you. So thank you very much. Appreciate you joining today.